Hello, everyone. I'm going to go over my dashboard and my call to action for my project, which is about the optimal type of male Olympic runners. So, the motivation for this project is that we know that athletes from other sports sort of have a distinct body type given their sport. Like, we know basketball players are tall, and we know football players are usually bigger, especially linemen. And I kind of wanted to provide that same analysis for track runners since that's my sport. So the first graph I have here on my dashboard is a graph of the the ratio of the runner's weight to the runner's height, and that as a function of the time that they ran their events. And this data is pulled from the 2016 Olympic finalists. So I'll just go through all the tabs I have here, and we can select the event that we want to look at out of the 10 running events. And we can see all the data points for each of the runners. And we can also hover over each data point and see the information of that runner, their name, their country that they're representing, and their height and their weight as well. And below here, we have two more graphs. Here we can change between which information we want to see, the height, the weight, and then the ratio. The graph on the left is a bar graph where we're just given the mean for each of these values. So the mean height, mean weight, mean ratio. And here on the right, we see a box and whiskers plot of the same data. And if you don't know what a box and whiskers plot is, the box for each category is centered at the mean, so it matches up with the bar graph on the left. But then the height of the box is plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean, so you can kind of see the variation in the data around the mean. And then the two lines coming from the top and bottom point to the maximum and minimum values for that data set. So here we have this line pointing to the maximum height for the 100-meter dash, which we know is Usain Bolt. He's kind of an outlier in this data. He was like 6'5", 205, which is pretty large for a runner. Trends in the data I noticed for height, I noticed that there isn't much of a correlation between the height of the runners and the event that they run, as we see a lot of overlap in the boxes, which means that there isn't a significant difference in correlation between the event distance and the height. But in weight, in the ratio, you see these two data sets start to fall off once we move past the sprinting events, where the sprinting events are 100 meters to the 400-meter hurdles. Then everything above that is considered a distance event. And that leads us to say that there is a correlation between the distance of the event and the weight to height ratio, as well as the weight of the runners. And back up here with the weight to height ratio versus the result, to conclude that if we want to make a conclusion that there's an optimal body type for the runners, we would want to see these start to converge as the time increases or decreases. So as the runners get faster, we see less variation in the data, and it sort of converges to a certain point, meaning that's the optimal weight to height ratio for that event. However, in all these data sets, it's sort of nebulous between each one. Like, we don't see a scattering or we see a scattering throughout, and we don't see that scattering converge down to a point at any given event. And that leads into my call to action. So here, I basically said everything I already said back there. We can tell, or we can conclude that there is no correlation between height and in the event that the runner competes in, but we can make a conclusion for the weight and weight to height ratio. And our data doesn't allow us to make a conclusion that there is an optimal weight to height ratio for a given event. However, if we had more data, that might change, because if we had a larger range of times, like for high school runners and collegiate runners included, we would probably see the more variation that we were looking for, and then it starts to converge to the more optimal ratio as we get down to the Olympic times, because right now we're only working with a small data set of 8 people per event, and that doesn't really allow us to make a conclusion for this specific conclusion that we're trying to make. So for athletes interested in this data, what this means is that if you're trying to run a distance event, then your training should be more catered to training methods that would make you more lighter given your height. So a smaller weight to height ratio than a sprinter would be. And again, this is just a correlation, not a causation. Like, just because you have a certain weight to height ratio doesn't mean that you'll be able to run these Olympic times in these events. A more accurate statement would be that the times are caused by the training that these Olympians go through, and their weight to height ratio is a byproduct of that time. So for runners that are interested in running a certain event, if your weight to height ratio isn't really aligned with the optimal weight to height ratio would be for that event, then you might consider training in a way that would change that. However, once you're already competing in that event, we weren't able to conclude that there's a significant optimal certain ratio for that event. Once you're already competing in that event, your weight to height ratio will probably converge to that value given your training. So you shouldn't really necessarily be worried about that if these are factors that you're considering when thinking about competing in an event.